Welcome to the Museum of Everything podcast. We're Dan and Josh, the curators of the Museum of Everything, here to discuss art, history, and culture. We're going to continue our tour of the Met Museum. This is the third episode. So far, we've done ancient Egypt, classical Greece and Rome, and the 19th century European collection. As of last time. This time we're going to go into 20th century American and European painting. This is one of my favorite sections of the Met, and so very excited to do that. But before we do, we are going to begin, as always, with a round of Museum of Everything pub trivia. So Josh, what is your first question to me, please?
Name 4 F. Scott Fitzgerald novels.
Okay. Tender as the Night and The Great Gatsby are actually all the F. Scott Fitzgerald novels that I know. I don't think I've read any others.
What, you've never read The Love of the Last Tycoon?
Oh, yeah, I have actually, now that you mention it.
And you never read This Side of Paradise?
No, I've not read This Side of Paradise.
You know, I've heard of it.
I have, but I don't like F. Scott Fitzgerald very much, I'm sorry to say.
Really?
I should probably reread him. Yes, I've never really been in his camp.
Interesting.
Yes.
You prefer Hemingway to Fitzgerald?
Vastly.
Ah, that's surprising. I definitely prefer Fitzgerald to Hemingway.
Why is that?
A little. I find his writing to be a little less self-consciously stylistic.
Well, that was only late Hemingway. Early Hemingway wasn't stylistically self-conscious at all.
That may be true, and I haven't read any of his early stuff in quite a while. The last thing of Hemingway's I read was A Movable Feast, and it was so irritating. It sort of turned me off Hemingway. I should really go back and give him another chance.
Not really fair. That was one of his very last things.
Yeah,
I find it tremendously entertaining, but it's true. It's Hemingway once he'd maxed out in the self-conscious trying to sound like Hemingway scale. F. Scott Fitzgerald, in my mind, has suffered from the overpopularity of The Great Gatsby. And I just haven't read Tender as a Night in a long time. I probably am not being fair to him.
The Last Tycoon, The Love of the Last Tycoon is my favorite of his novels, even though it's unfinished. And it's not really unfinished in a meaningful way, because the plot doesn't really matter. But it's a beautiful novel. I find him a superb writer, and I think he writes as he wants to without bothering to aim for some particular target of stylistic genius the way Hemingway does. But you're right that I should give Hemingway's early stuff another chance. Which, The Sun Also Rises. That's the Blood in the Afternoon. I did enjoy that a lot.
The Sun Also Rises is a greater novel.
Right, but probably. I was thinking of the bullfighting novel, the one with sort of the coda about Sidney Franklin, which is interesting.
Yes. A Movable Feast is stylistically a little obnoxious at times, but it still contains many hugely entertaining anecdotes.
The thing is that it claims that he's using things that he wrote when he was young, which is obviously not true, but it sort of confuses you about his periods.
No, I think it just incorporates stories or anecdotes from when he was young. I don't think he's claiming that he's recycling things that he wrote when he was young verbatim. It doesn't really matter. I will give Fitzgerald another chance. You don't happen to have a copy of Tender as the Night on you by any chance?
I think I do, actually. It's not here. It's in my car, in my big bag of books.
Okay, well,
which
maybe
every car should have.
If you could bring that over afterwards, I will read it again. I don't know why it didn't grab me the first time, but it didn't. So.
It's as you say. It's probably your sort of understandable antipathy towards The Great Gatsby because everyone else loves it so much. So The Great Gatsby is an absolutely wonderful novel, but there's a good reason it's popular. As you pointed out many times in our private conversations and maybe on the podcast, everyone loves it because it's the only serious book they're required to read in school. But everyone also loves it because it's an absolutely brilliant novel. I know it's easy to sort of take a turn against things because they're very popular and sort of the natural instinctive thing to do. But, the Beatles legitimately are the best band. It's not just because everyone likes them.
Now that we're publishing daily reels to Instagram, some of which are getting hundreds of thousands and even millions of views occasionally.
Yeah, you had one last week that's about to hit 3 million views.
Well, I've been checking out reels on Instagram more often than I should, which has not improved my life. And I recently
on the contrary, everyone should use Instagram all the time.
You're right. But I saw this channel where a young lady, as it were, is summarizing various plots semi in costume, and she did one for The Great Gatsby, and I found not only did I find it rather hard to watch, but it reminded me of everything that I disliked about the popular approach to The Great Gatsby, I guess, which is English teachers, I think, latch onto symbolism because it's the only thing that they can, because when you don't understand art, it's easy. Symbolism is an easy way to pretend that you do.
I can see symbolism even when it isn't there.
Exactly. Same thing in painting, by the way, or in any art. If you discuss things in terms of symbolism, it relieves you of the burden of having to actually appreciate the art for itself. I don't think that F. Scott Fitzgerald would have loved the attempt to cast everything in his novel into
and that's the reason that I like Fitzgerald more than Hemingway, because I feel like Hemingway is trying to write art and Fitzgerald is just trying to write a really good novel. You know what I mean?
But did he succeed? I don't know.
Yeah, and he definitely succeeded.
I'm not ready to reread The Great Gatsby. I'm sorry, but I will reread Tender is the Night and perhaps The Last Tycoon as well. So after our
I would start with
discussion-
The Last Tycoon, actually.
Why?
It's my favorite.
Okay. In any event, I missed that first question. So
I think that's maybe the first time you've missed the first question.
Perhaps. It's a sad beginning then. I will put the first question to you, which is, in Bizet's opera Carmen, which you absolutely love.
It's true.
Carmen seduces Don José, the hero who is also a guard or the member of the local military establishment, by promising that if he lets her escape, he will have to take the hit for it and get arrested himself for his incompetence. After he gets out, he is going to meet her where?
Près de rempart de Séville, chez mon ami de Las Pastilles.
Yes, that is correct.
Above the ramparts of Seville at the bar of her friend Las Pastilles, which is a meeting place for snuggles. Snuggles. Smuggles. Not snugglers, for smugglers. It is a meeting place for smugglers.
For smugglers.
Into the country.
Which leads on to one of the most thrilling songs in the opera, where everyone is dancing at Las Pastilles. And the tempo keeps increasing. It's a really thrilling song.
Frenetic. It's like someone is having a moment of mania.
It's a frenzied moment. It's extremely exciting. The whole opera is extremely exciting, and it's one of my favorites. One of our favorites.
I'm constantly going back and forth on what my favorite opera is. Is it The Marriage of Figaro or Carmen? And some of Mozart's other operas are often considered The Magic Flute, Così fan tutte, Don Giovanni, but it always comes down to The Marriage of Figaro and Carmen, and it's just whichever one I've listened to most recently.
For me, Don Giovanni is by far my favorite opera.
I love Don Giovanni. I think that Don Giovanni's high moments are as good as the best moments in either Carmen or Figaro, but Carmen and Figaro really don't drop from their peaks. They're so strong from the opening number to the last.
You don't find the second half of The Marriage of Figaro drags a little bit?
No, I think some of the best arias in the show are in the second half, particularly the one sung by the Count's wife. The slow number where she sort of reflects on her.
Basically the sole highlight until
the
but
end. it's one of Mozart's greatest arias. It's
but the rest of the material, I think, in the second half is considerably weaker. I think that he should have edited that a little bit. Anyway,
I disagree. I never tire of The Marriage of Figaro. Though it's the Carmen has the advantage, I think, of being, maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I think it's considerably tighter and shorter. It just sort of snaps from one moment to the next.
Yes, Carmen is a very great opera. It's so different as an opera from Mozart's great operas that it's almost a separate musical form, I would say. Just like Gilbert and Sullivan, which we both love, is almost a different musical form. True. And by the way, I'm tired of people calling Gilbert and Sullivan just operetta as though to pretend that it's not serious music.
It's absurd because after the operas I named by Mozart and then Carmen, I think the most beautiful operas, not from a comedy point of view or a clever dialogue kind, strictly from a musical point of view, are Gilbert and Sullivan's. I like them better than Puccini. I like them better than Verdi. I like them better than Fidelio.
By and large, I agree. And the fact is that there's a lot of beautiful music in them, and it's not as though the great Italian or Mozart's operas were not allowed to be funny and buffoonish because in many respects they are explicitly. And you could say that Gilbert and Sullivan are following that tradition better than other serious opera.
American and English opera critics can understand the jokes in Gilbert and Sullivan, and they don't understand the jokes in the operas in German and Italian and French, not in the same way anyways. So it's they see them as being more serious. I think that may have something to do with it.
I think it's a case of pretentiousness,
also,
largely.
Yeah, and also in terms of lyrics, in Gilbert and Sullivan, the lyrics scan, which they do not do in either Mozart or Bizet. Not even close. The singers really have to stretch the words. And so it's something to bear in mind in terms of successful art creation. Actually having lyrics that scan makes it seem a little more poppy, perhaps, but is
well, this is
not something
against
you
Mozart. I certainly love Mozart operas, most of them at least. Verdi, Puccini, they have some good moments. They tend to be a little bit overwrought and histrionic, as the Italians can be at times. Anyway,
I listened to Turandot recently. I like that. Or Turandot. There seems to be some debate as to how it's pronounced.
Next question to me, please.
All right. Name 8 Gershwin musicals.
Oh, all right.
These can be Broadway shows or movies.
There are a lot of name multiples in your questions these days, which I think is a bad habit you've inherited from me in my early pub trivia sessions. But I think these are good questions anyway. Okay.
I was going to do 10, but 10 would be kind of pushing it a little bit, so 8 is where we've landed.
I can think of the songs, obviously, but I'm not sure what shows they come from. Strike Up the Band.
Okay, that's 1.
No, that's 2.
I mean, that's 2. That is a correct one. I am stunned that you are not knocking this out of the park, I have to say. Our listeners may not know how big a Gershwin enthusiast you are. I am essentially the biggest Gershwin enthusiast in the world, and you are even a greater enthusiast than me. So,
Shall We Dance?
Okay.
Of Thee I Sing.
That's 4. Come on, Dan.
Funny Face.
Yep, that's 5. Only 3 more.
I don't know. I'm out of them for the moment. I mean, where did Kickin' the Clouds Away and so forth? Those earlier songs that I'm thinking of, I just can't think of the shows that they went into. I mean, unless you can't count Porgy and Bess, I suppose.
I'll count Porgy and Bess. That's 6. You only need 2 more if you want to keep going.
Lady Be Good.
Yep, that's 7.
But I think you gave that away.
Well, I mean, if you didn't know the show, you wouldn't have known what I was humming. So I think I'm going to count that.
And Let 'Em Eat Cake.
Okay, that's 8. Good work. It was like pulling teeth, but we got there. You left out Damsel in Distress.
Was that a Broadway show?
No, you include, like, Shall We Dance? It was a movie, but I said you could include movies.
Oh.
I mean,
for some reason I wasn't thinking of movies, but I mean, Shall We Dance? But
all right, well, you got there in the end.
What else did I miss?
So there was Tiptoes, Rosalie, Treasure Girl, Showgirl, Girl Crazy, Of Thee I Sing, Pardon My English, Let 'Em Eat Cake, and I think you named the other ones.
Girl Crazy is the only one of those that I really just forgot. The other ones are
well,
very obscure.
We saw Let 'Em Eat Cake.
I named Let 'Em Eat Cake also.
Okay. So anyways, you got most of them.
I would say that,
and Rosalie, I know you've listened to the overture many times.
I have, but they are relatively more obscure shows. Nonetheless,
that's why I didn't do 10. Obviously,
I got that one. Thanks.
Numbers, but.
My second question to you is, on Christmas night of 1776, when Washington crossed the Delaware, it was to attack what force in what battle?
All right. The force he was attacking were the British Army.
Well, no, I'm actually not.
The Hessians?
That's correct. He was attacking the Hessians, who were the German mercenary force hired by the British to sort of extend and expand their own army.
Battle was it?
It is a battle named after the town, the nearest town to his crossing point on the far side of the river. And he was crossing from the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware.
The Battle of Trenton?
That's correct. It was the Battle of Trenton. So, very good.
I mean, that it required a few hints, but I'll take it.
We'll give that to you as 2 to you. You have a third question to me?
I do. What was the nickname of VMF 214, a Marine fighter squadron?
The Black Sheep Squadron.
Very good.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only Marine Corps fighter squadron from the Second World War we'd be likely to know. Fighter
I would,
squadrons in general are designated VF. The F is for fighter. V is the designation they gave for heavier than air squadrons, because at the time the military had lighter than air as well. And the M, of course, is for the Marine Corps. So VMF 214, that was Pappy Boeington's Black Sheep Squadron.
for
Which
an honorary bonus question, what was the name of the island on which they were primarily based? It was not Vela La Cava.
was it Vela La Vela?
Yes, it was Vela La Vela. They changed that for the TV show, The Black Sheep Squadron, because they thought people would think the name Vela La Vela was silly. So they made up Vela La Cava.
Well, that wasn't a bad made-up name, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it's a fine
and
name.
though the TV show is wildly historically inaccurate, it was a fun show, and we both enjoyed it as kids.
Yeah, there are a lot of things in the show that I assumed were inaccurate, but did actually come from Boyington's memoir. For instance, the name of the colonel he didn't like was Colonel Lard. I don't assume. I know he made that up for the thing, but I thought they made it up for the TV show, which was kind of infantile. But since it came from the book, it makes it a little less infantile.
Do you remember the name of the actor who plays Boeington in the show?
I don't.
I do recall his saying that they had Boeington as a consultant on the show, and that Boeington told him that he wished that he had been in the Black Sheep Squadron so he could have beat the crap out of him because he was such an arrogant son of a bitch.
Yeah, something like that.
In any event, all right, fair enough. That gives me 2 out of 3. You can win it by answering this question correctly, since you already have 2 out of 2. And the question is, if you don't count the Croton Aqueduct from 1848, what is the oldest bridge to Manhattan?
Is it the Brooklyn Bridge?
It is the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883 and was the first sort of semi-modern suspension bridge, at least the first suspension bridge to use metal cables instead of the iron ties that we associate with industrial-era bridges.
You really would have thought there would be an older one over the East River.
Yes.
Which is much smaller. I mean, not the Harlem River.
I mean, well, there probably
but there was really no one
bridges
living up there until reasonably recently. I mean, Manhattan was developed from the Battery northward, so it didn't reach the top of the island in relative terms for quite a while.
I think there were earlier bridges that were temporary or wood or, that haven't survived. But in any event, the oldest still surviving and usable bridge is the Brooklyn Bridge. We don't count the Croton Aqueduct, although it still exists, because it wasn't built for passenger or even foot traffic, although now people can walk across it. It was built as an aqueduct. So in any event, Brooklyn Bridge is pretty magnificent engineering, and there's something that is effortlessly modern about it, even though it was built such a very long time ago. In any event, we don't have to go to extra questions today, because you cleanly win that round of Museum of Everything pub trivia.
I'm afraid you've let yourself down, Dan.
Yeah, all right.
It's a shame, because I had some good extra innings questions, but I guess I'll save them for next time.
Save them for the next episode, because now we are going to discuss the subject in hand, which is to continue our tour through the Met Museum of Art in New York City, which is one of the greatest art museums in the world, one of a few genuinely encyclopedic art museums. I've been thinking about the quality of curatorship in the museum, though. The fact is that, considering the quality of the collection, they've been very good at collecting very good pieces, generally speaking. And yet, the quality of the curatorship leaves a lot to be desired, I would say, the way they display them in a lot of areas.
Do we want to start attacking the curators of rival museums?
Is there some reason not to? I mean, I don't think they would consider us as a rival museum as yet, in as much as we don't even have
they should.
Space. Well, we're just pointing this out. Is this not fair? Would you think that the curatorship of the Met Museum is in general making the most of their collection?
Well, I suppose that depends what they have in their vaults.
We know what they have in their vaults.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of good stuff isn't on display. Basically, I would say the museum is much better laid out than most of the other art museums in New York City.
Is it, though? Think about the Frick, for example, which actually on a piece-by-piece basis is a vastly more impressive collection, considering that it was collected essentially as a passion project of one guy, is more impressive still.
Doesn't the Met own the Frick now, by the way?
I don't think so. But whether they do or not, the Frick as a collection in and of itself is a real masterpiece. One of the greatest art collections in the world, collected by someone who really knew what he was doing, and now displayed in a wonderful way. The Frick was always wonderful.
I agree, but it's a tiny museum.
It's a tiny museum, but the point is on a piece-by-piece basis, they are a great collection, a greater collection, I would say. And this is the main point, they are displayed in a more effective way. I think that the curatorship at the Frick, which is relatively recently reopened after a multi-year restoration, has done a very good job. For most of the life of the Frick, or at least the life of the Frick as we remember it, only the ground floor of the museum, that is the house, was open. This used to be Frick's private house. Post-restoration, they've opened up a lot of rooms on the second floor, and you can now walk up the main staircase, which has that lovely pipe organ in it. It is really nicely done restoration. I give them top marks for that. But there are other better curated collections in New York as well. The Neue Gallery, also on a piece-by-piece basis, is probably a more impressive collection, although of course it's a highly focused one, but the quality of the pieces in the Neue Gallery is astonishingly good. That was Ronald Lauder's collection, and he bought almost nothing that wasn't worth having, which is certainly not the case with the Met. And they also displayed it in a very effective way. Of course, they have a lot less space. But I think that although a lot of the Met we're used to it.
Let me ask you just a hypothetical question. It's slightly off topic. What do you think is worth more, the Met's collection or their building and property?
Probably the collection, I would say. I mean,
I think so too, but it's one of the few buildings that's in the park, and it's a gigantic building. I wonder what it would be worth if you sold it in Manhattan property values.
As I've learned from my time in finance, because as you may or may not know, my day job is actually for a hedge fund. The value of something depends to an extent on how much time you have to sell it. So if the Met were forced to dispose of its entire collection all at once, it would be very different from if they were going to sell pieces gradually over a decade, which is probably what it would take to liquidate things and get fair market price for all of it. If you flooded the art market with the million pieces in the Met collection, you would change the face of the art market substantially.
I know. I think if the Met said they were having an auction for their entire collection next month, every other museum in the world would get their budgets ready, and the bidding wars would be insane.
It's possible. It would certainly be exciting.
Speaking of bidding wars, did you see what a Ferrari Luce sold for the first time? The Chassis Zero or Chassis One, whatever it was. This charity.
I would like to say $10, but I assume it's going to be a lot of money.
No, so a McLaren F1, which if you're not a car person,
it's the greatest car of all time.
Yeah, it's the greatest car of all time. I think most car enthusiasts, I think if they were, gun to their head, would say is either the Ferrari 250 or the McLaren F1.
You mean the 250 GTO?
GTO, right. Just for the most collectible car, not necessarily their personal favorites. But so a Ferrari F1 sold just before the Luce, a few lots before the Luce at this auction. I guess it was part of Monterey
Wait a
Car
minute.
Week.
First, why is this brand new car in an auction? I mean,
Ferrari apparently has a charity. I have no idea what it's a charity for. Maybe it's just a charity for Ferrari.
Probably. I mean,
yeah. So they donated it as a charity item to themselves to be sold, so the money would go to their
that was
foundation.
Awfully nice of them.
So the McLaren F1 sold. It was the highest price a McLaren F1 has ever fetched at auction. I think it was like $28.5 million.
This is getting frustrating because the Museum of Everything definitely needs a McLaren F1.
I mean, it seemed insane that it cost $1 million. And
yes.
So then the Luce went up a few lots later and got $40 million. So
what?
more than the most expensive McLaren F1 ever sold.
I'm
which
just
is
say
it's contemptible.
This is the Ferrari Luce is the Damien Hirst's bisected sheep of the car world.
I would rather own a Damien Hirst bisected sheep than a Ferrari Luce.
I think
that's not true. It's not close, though.
Well, it's about even, just because I think that is a reasonable analogy. It is something that must be bought only for the curiosity.
The difference between Damien Hirst's work and the Ferrari Luce, and I don't want to criticize the guy who designed it specifically. I don't know who designed it, and I don't know what he was thinking. But Damien Hirst is at least an original thinker, which you have to give him some credit for. Whereas the Ferrari Luce looks like the most generic, unimaginative, uninspired thing that's ever been produced in the history of mankind.
Yes, and the fact that it comes from Ferrari is particularly depressing because you don't expect that. Well, I mean, actually, I think we do expect it from them now, because separate question, when was the last truly beautiful Ferrari?
It depends whether or not you consider the 458 Italia to be truly beautiful.
I don't think I do. It was very striking.
I go back and forth on it. The last Ferrari that I am positive was an absolutely beautiful car was the 575 Maranello, which was basically the same design as the earlier 550
I'm going to say
Maranello.
I'm positive the 430 was a beautiful car. And I
don't
one just
think
the other
430
day.
was a beautiful car.
We've always differed on this. You prefer the 360. I prefer the 430.
And I love the 360, but I don't think it's beautiful per se.
I
just
saw
think
one
it's
today,
a
as a matter of fact.
A 430 or a 360?
A 360. But last week, I saw a 430 actually parked on the street on Collins Avenue around 71st. And in case anyone wants to go see if it's still there, it was an incredibly beautiful car. And this is the thing that you forget when you see the 458 or more recent Ferraris, or the stupid 12-cylinder shark face Ferrari that they're currently making. You almost forget what a beautiful Ferrari looks like. I think that we're very brainwashed by the current Ferrari design language, which is actually very generically similar to McLaren's current design language. All of these supercar makers, they are so completely unimaginative. The Corvette, which is vastly cheaper, looks better, but also a little bit generically like a Ferrari of the modern stamp. But when you look at a 430, that is a beautiful car. I just, looking at it, I thought, boy, it's been a long time, honestly, since I saw a car that I don't want to say took my breath away, but really left me feeling inspired.
Speaking of cars on Collins Avenue taking your breath away, I saw, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a 550 in person in my life. I drove behind it for a while, just because we were stuck in traffic. I wasn't following it. I was following it. I mean, I wasn't following it intentionally. In any event, what a beautiful car. It did take my breath away, and it was just such a perfect design. So perfect.
You must see what I'm saying then, that the comparison between one of these older cars that really does take your breath away and all the modern designs, it leaves one feeling so depressed. And then occasionally we see designs that look slightly better, like the McLaren Longtail, but they're still very uninspired compared to these classics.
McLaren debuted a new car this week also. At the same day, I think that Gordon Murray debuted his copy of his own F1, which I love. Oh my goodness, the S1 it's called, the Gordon Murray S1.
That's gorgeous. By the way, Gordon Murray, if you're listening, we would really like to have one of those cars for the museum. So please get in touch.
I sincerely think that Gordon Murray is one of the probably 100 greatest artists of the last 100 years.
That's a very interesting point of view. I think quite defensible, as a matter of fact, because his car is a masterpiece from every point of view. And it was a favorite of ours growing up. But
we shouldn't spend too long on cars. I will just say that in addition to his beautiful sort of homage to his own design, McLaren debuted a new design this week that is the first car they've done since they brought back the road cars, starting with their, the MP40, whatever it was that came as the
412C.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of an homage to a one-off, I think, that
the so-called
McLaren
6GT. That looks like it.
And it's not a beautiful car, but it's a step in the right direction.
No,
because it hasn't. All right. It hasn't got all of the creases and fins and cuts.
Yeah,
that have been
as a
ruining
result, you realize what this is. It's just a copy of the Maserati MC20 or whatever.
Well,
it was.
I thought it looked exactly like a Noble, and apparently that's what the two cars that everyone's been comparing.
Okay,
to.
so yeah, it's just because it
but
doesn't.
The Noble's
look
a good-looking car.
Well, yeah, of course, but the point is that that's not an original design either.
Well, I'm glad that McLaren is stepping away from making every car look exactly the same. They're trying to be like Porsche, I guess, and failing. And it's making their design
that's because they had a
unimaginative.
bad design to begin with, or at least a very boring design to begin with. Boring. And the lack of inspiration, it's really incredible. And I think it reflects the fact that these companies must now be run by businessmen rather than men who have a genuine passion for beauty, for automotive beauty. You can tell that in the design. It's the same thing with the Ferrari Luce. I think the reason that it's such a generically, not ugly even, but just completely vapid piece of garbage is because it was designed by someone who doesn't love cars, who doesn't dream about cars, who doesn't dream about automotive beauty every single waking moment the way originally Ferraris originally clearly reflected a huge passion for automotive beauty, which just doesn't exist at Ferrari anymore. It may exist more at Pagani or something like that, but Ferrari just doesn't care. They don't care about cars, and that's why their cars look like that. Their cars look like they don't care about cars. Sorry.
Yeah, I tend to think you are probably right, not knowing who runs any of these companies. But the thing that perplexes me is that they've made their cars all look sort of the same, generic and ugly, with cuts and creases and tail and spoilers and so forth, in an effort to make them go extremely fast, which is pointless because none of these cars can go anywhere as fast as an electric car anymore, which is sad.
let's get to the main subject. So when we left off last time, we were at the secondary gift shop, which is at the end of the corridor of European 19th century painting and sculpture. Now, what I would do next is cross over that corridor, which will take you into 20th century and contemporary American art, and then you go down a couple flights of steps, and then you get to 20th century European art. These galleries are actually under reconstruction, which is not the worst thing. I mean, I hope they don't keep them closed for very long. The Met, as you may know, has just finished a multi-year project to restore the European, that is pre-19th century European painting, the galleries that are at the top of the main stairs. That's done now. And so they've moved on to these 20th century galleries. And I think that's a good thing, because this was an area that was, when I was talking about the Mets not being the best curated, this is an area that always stood out as not being the best curated. Considering the exceptional strength of their collection, they really messed it up. So I don't know what they're going to end up with here, but I'd like to discuss what they have. It's worth discussing the collection, and maybe we can give them some good ideas about how they should be displayed, because I do have a couple. If you cross this road that is defined by the little gift shop, at the near end of which you'll see the hall for special exhibits. At the far end, this is where you cross over into 20th century art. And you enter a room which for a long time did contain a Damien Hirst, his Dead Shark, which I don't think is the name of the artwork. He gave it some incredibly pretentious title. This was on long-term loan to the Met until they noticed that Damien Hirst had not preserved his shark properly, and as a result it was rotting. He blamed his gallery for this, by the way. No one accepted responsibility for it, but people noted that the shark looked a little bit down in the mouth, and they had to remove his tank. So he's no longer there, and they replaced it with a special commissioned work in, I think, the year before COVID in 2019 by a worthless sculptor named Charles Ray. And this was a sculpture unlike the rest of his pieces. In a way, it was more interesting. It's a gigantic bas-relief of a horse or a pair of horses in sort of a classical style, but much too large. I don't know if you've even seen it, in fact.
I have not.
It's really quite disappointing. It could have, as an interesting idea, it just completely lacking in art, and I think reflects the Met's confusion, just as the Damien Hirst did, not knowing exactly what to do with contemporary art. There are decent, and there are some genuinely good artists working now, but the Met curators, I would say...
We should perhaps do a show on artists who are working now who we like.
Yes, because there are several, but the Met doesn't know what to do, and this gigantic bas-relief reflects that. So in any event, you move beyond that, and then you get into 20th century abstract expressionists, American abstract expressionists, and the first paintings that you would have seen are the Rothko collection. Now, Rothko was incredibly specific about how he wanted his paintings displayed, and he painted them with this format in mind, which is, he said, low ceilings and very low warm electric lights. I think he actually specified 40-watt bulbs and warm light. And so the Met instead put the paintings in a 24-foot ceiling room with lights that I think they borrowed from a police station. It's like floodlights. The fact is, the Met curators must be aware of Rothko's expressed wishes, so it's rather surprising that they would have contradicted them completely. I mean, it's the opposite. And nonetheless, there are a few great paintings that really grab you. And this was one of the areas where if you went at Met after hours, when there are a couple days of the week open until 9 p.m., it was an area that you could have more or less to yourself. They have a large blue and red canvas that's really gorgeous, and a large late brown canvas. In as much as art is sort of emotional encoding, Rothko figured this out really remarkably well. It's amazing that with just a few colors on a canvas, he could, I think, inspire such deep emotions. But this is certainly the case when I stand in front of some of his greatest paintings. And you really have to see the paintings in person to appreciate what's going on, because photography just doesn't capture the degree to which we're dealing with multiple layers of color built up one on top of the other with a certain translucence which adds depth to these colors, which you really just can't see in a photograph. He painted with extremely thinned paints. He would use so much turpentine that it would essentially dissolve all of the oil in the paint and leave us with just pigment. And he would use layers and layers of pigment and build up extremely deep colors that also work in such extraordinary harmony, not just within the painting, but with each other. And this is, again, one of the areas that the Met really falls down in their display of the paintings. They don't have many great Rothkos, but they certainly have more than most galleries will ever have. And they could display them in a very effective way, shoulder to shoulder, but they sort of scatter them throughout the galleries rather than putting them together. And again, they put them in a room that's much too high. If they can't do anything about the height of the room, they could at least light them properly. Rothko should be seen in just the barest possible light. They should be lit as if it were by a nightstand by your bed. When you turn on your light in the middle of the night to get up, that's the sort of level of lighting that Rothko imagined his paintings having, and it casts them into a completely different space. I would love to see Rothko's paintings displayed that way. I hope someday they will be, and the Met, hey, you guys now have an opportunity to do it properly because you're redoing these galleries, so let's hope that they do.
Well, maybe they will. Rothko is becoming such a collectible painter that I feel like a lot of the private Rothkos are just never going to be on display again, which is very sad.
Well, there was a really extraordinary Rothko show, which may be the biggest Rothko show we'll see in the rest of our lifetime, in Paris 3 years ago or so at the Louis Vuitton Foundation in the Bois de Boulogne, which I was lucky enough to go and see. And that was one of those few artistic experiences that is good enough that it qualifies as life-changing. They had a whole building full of Rothko paintings, and several great rooms where the walls were just lined with Rothko. And boy, I can't tell you what an extraordinary effect it was. And it really gave you a better idea of how the painting should be seen, because Rothko should be legion. They need to be together in a large group, because although they work by themselves, their effect is multiplied powerfully when they're together in...
Yeah, well, if you put enough Rothkos together, they become a Hans Hofmann. By the way, speaking of Rothko shows, there's a good stage play about Rothko. I didn't see it when it was... Yeah, I didn't see it when it was actually being performed. It's pretty recent. It's like 10 years old, but they filmed it, and I saw that. Alfred Molina plays Rothko. It was good. It's not as good as, say, the Pollock movie or the Picasso movie starring Anthony Hopkins, but it gives you some insight into his very latent career process.
I've never read a complete biography. I've only read short biographies of Rothko because I don't think there was ever a completely satisfactory one. There is an excellent biography of Jackson Pollock by Stephen Naifeh. That is one of the best artist biographies I've read. Not nearly as good as the Giacometti biography by James Lord, which stands absolutely by itself in a class of one, but it's very good. It's a very, very good biography. And by comparison, the biographies I read of de Kooning, not nearly as good. Hopper, not nearly as good. And I just couldn't find a good one on Rothko. I hope someone will write one. Unfortunately, writing a great biography is not just a matter of having all the facts. The person doing the writing has to be a good writer. And that is actually hard to come by. James Lord really wanted to be a novelist, for example, and he wasn't one, but in a way he rendered a greater service to humanity than if he had been a great one, because it turned out that he was a great biographer. That is a very particular skill, and not everyone who wishes to devote himself to covering a particular subject that is in biography is actually capable of doing so in a readable manner.
I agree, and my favorite art books, that is art biographies, were all written by Ross King, who wrote Brunelleschi's Dome. He wrote Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling. I think he wrote, is it Leonardo and the Last Supper or just the Last Supper? Yeah, Leonardo and the Last Supper.
I just started reading Brunelleschi's Dome, and as you have recommended it to me for years, and I immediately found it extraordinarily readable, brilliantly written.
It's a wonderful book.
And recommended to anyone who's interested in the Renaissance in Florence, or really just anyone who would like to read a very readable art book, because it's also not long. You can read it quickly.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you now something about Vasari's lives, but I feel like we really need to get on with the subject.
All right, yeah, let's move on to 20th century art. There are good Rothko canvases here. They are interspersed between a lot of relatively less good artists. Barnett Newman is very popular these days. During the actual, they called him poor old Barney. That is, the other artist called him that during the 40s and 50s when this was actually going on. Everyone recognized that he was an inferior talent. He has become popular because for a long time in the more recent history of art acquisition, he was one of the only artists of that era, of the beginning abstract expressionists, that was still affordable because his paintings weren't as good. That gave him a second wind of collectability, and that in turn made it appear that he was better than he actually was as everyone started buying his paintings. He's not very good. He has no imagination and no sense of color, clearly no ability in drawing. Rothko didn't have ability in drawing either, but he had such incredible depth as an artist and in color that it didn't matter. And so he's one of the many disappointments that you will find in this wing. There's some medium quality pieces like a sculpture by Isamu Noguchi. He was an interesting, if not a great sculptor. And then there is Pollock and Kooning. And
well, there's also Ellsworth Kelly.
You met Ellsworth Kelly once.
I met Ellsworth Kelly at the Met. I was at the Matisse show, and
I was at the Matisse show. You met him and didn't even tell me until after we left.
Oh, yeah. So, no, we weren't there together. This was on a different day.
What?
Yeah, no, you weren't there.
I
when
was.
This happened.
We were. Yes,
were you?
I was. I
don't remember.
We
that.
went to the Met
sorry.
together. We split up to go look at different things. And when we reunited afterwards, you told me you met Ellsworth Kelly, and you didn't even call me.
Just briefly, the story is a good one. It was in the last room of the Matisse show, and I was just looking at one of these extraordinary Matisses. It was of his studio. And I was standing there a really long time, and an old man, somewhat infirm in appearance, with an oxygen hose in his nose, was rolled into the gallery from the back.
In a wheelchair?
In a wheelchair. And he was helped to his feet, and he came over to look at the painting, and I sort of smiled at him and nodded, and, politely. He seemed like a nice fellow, and we both just stood there staring at this painting for a long time. And he turned to me after a while and said, "You're looking at this painting like an artist." And I thanked him. It's just, I was just trying to be nice to an old man. I had no idea what Ellsworth Kelly looked like. And we just started chatting about art in general, and finally said, I'm a painter. And I said, oh, really? I just, again, just being polite, he said, some of my paintings are here on, in the other gallery. And I thought, oh, really? So anyways, he was a very, very nice guy, very unassuming. And he died pretty soon after that, which was a shame, but it was nice to have met him.
I know. So thanks for calling me.
Sorry. I even in the story, I didn't remember that you were there. So
yeah, I was just enjoying the Met, not realizing that Ellsworth Kelly was there.
Hey, look, you met Tibbets and didn't call me.
That was different. I was 6 years old.
Well, anyways, let's move on.
All right. So there are three great pillars of American abstract expressionism: Rothko, de Kooning, and Jackson Pollock. And they are all represented in the Met to varying degree. You have to remember that, after all, the Museum of Modern Art is supposed to be New York's main collection of modern art. But the Met dragged itself kicking and screaming into modern art as well. For a long time, they weren't sure they actually wanted to have any modern art. They thought they might, like the Louvre, cut their collection off, at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th. But they ultimately decided rather late that they were going to start collecting 20th century and even contemporary art. And they ended up with a bunch of very good pieces. Reasonably good Rothko collection. Certainly you'd consider it great by most modern standards. And a great de Kooning collection, actually one of the strongest de Kooning collections anywhere, and then a pretty bland and disappointing Pollock collection, which is really too bad because they could have bought lots and lots of Pollocks. I mean, there's certainly not for lack of funds.
What was the Pollock that went to Australia that the Met chose not to buy?
Blue Poles. One of Pollock's last and greatest paintings, and the Met just didn't feel like buying it.
Well, it was the last of his greatest paintings. He had sort of a whole series of sort of very depressing paintings that came later, but no one wants to look at those.
The Met does have a few. I mean, it has several Pollocks. It has some of his earlier sort of pre-Pollock Pollocks before Pollock figured out his drip painting style,
which I really like.
Some of them are very good. Pacify is there. May not be on display at the moment. Pollock is an interesting case. Again, an artist who had a really striking sense of color. Not exactly a great colorist the way Rothko was, certainly, but really striking and unique. He clearly had a great deal of imagination. And although he didn't have drawing per se, he really couldn't draw much, but that's sort of why he invented the drip style of painting. When he finally hit on that, it really worked out quite well. The drip paintings that the Met have are not his best, generally. They have a very large canvas, which is one of his least impressive large paintings. I think it's Autumn Rhythm, but there's a smaller one that...
I just want to mention regarding his big canvases. One of my favorite Pollocks is I think it was his first big canvas that he did for Peggy Guggenheim for his
Yeah, the
Guggenheim
Guggenheim
show.
mural.
Right, the Guggenheim mural. And something that I have really wanted for the museum since we first started talking about this many, many years ago is in the Jackson Pollock movie starring, what's that guy's name?
Ed Harris.
Ed Harris. In the Jackson Pollock movie starring Ed Harris, he paints a copy of this mural, and he does a brilliant job. It's a very good copy, and you get to see him paint it basically from start to finish. It's
Which he practiced a lot.
Right, yeah. I would love to have his version of that for the museum.
So would I. It's a masterpiece.
It
Beautiful
would be
painting.
and they couldn't have destroyed it. It must exist somewhere.
I wouldn't think so. I agree. It would be lovely to have it. Ed Harris doing that as a passion project, that is his biopic of Pollock, probably the greatest movie about an artist that has been made.
It is. I think it is. And I love Ed Harris, by the way. He's one of my favorite actors.
He's excellent.
I really can't think of him as not Gene Kranz from Apollo 13, but he's very versatile. Gene Kranz and Jackson Pollock, two men at the opposite end of the important American scale. I mean, that they're both very important. They have nothing in common beyond looking like Ed Harris.
The greatest painting that the Met has in their Pollock collection is a canvas called Number 28. It's too bad that it doesn't have a better title than that. Pollock didn't care about titles for his paintings, and he certainly wasn't an intellectual, which is probably for the best. Clement Greenberg, who loved his paintings and was the champion art critic who really brought him to the attention of serious collectors and to the New York museums, named a lot of his best-known paintings, like Autumn Rhythm, which the Met has, and Lavender Mist, which is a much greater painting in the National Gallery in Washington,
I had no idea
D.C.
he hadn't named those himself.
Summertime, all those great paintings, pretty much named by Clement Greenberg. I think Blue Poles as well. Left to his own devices, Pollock just numbered his canvases because that was what he was. He wasn't really interested in their names. That does make them really hard to keep track of, though. Number 28, as it's called, is a really beautiful painting that has a sort of aluminum feel to it because it has some aluminum paint in it. You won't be able to see it if you go because it's not on display at the moment. But I do hope that once they finish restoring these galleries, it will be back up on the walls. That is the best Pollock that they have, and it's a Pollock that you feel you can really get lost in. You could dive into it. That's the thing about Pollocks is you want to stand close enough to them that you don't actually see the whole painting. It's a different experience. Rather than trying to take the whole painting in, these are very large canvases, generally speaking. Move really close to them so that the drip painting, fills your entire field of vision, and it will feel as though it's reaching out to physically grab hold of your shirt and pull you into the painting. It's an extraordinary effect, and that's how I like to look at the Pollocks. Most of the Pollocks here are a little bit too loose, just don't have enough in them. The gigantic canvas, which is a wall-sized canvas, is really too big to have the concentrated energy that a Pollock is supposed to have. The slightly smaller canvas, the Number 28, is a really great effort, and it is the only prime Pollock that the Met has. Despite the fact that they could have bought so many and did buy very many, they only managed to get their hands on one legitimately great canvas, and that's it. However, it is legitimately great, and so if you have a chance to see it, you can spend a lot of time standing in front of it.
Is it canvas? I always sort of assumed it was paper.
No, it's canvas. However, he didn't, generally speaking, have the canvas stretched on a stretcher bars. That is, most paintings are canvas stretched over a wooden frame. It's a multi-stage process to prepare the canvas that involves first stretching the canvas and then priming it. The primer is a white gesso that goes over the canvas and sort of fills up the little microscopic pores in the canvas material so that the paint won't simply soak in. In abstract expressionism, a lot of artists began painting on unprimed canvas, which delivers a very different effect, which looks a little bit more like a tie-dyed t-shirt. And Morris Louis, the color field painter, who is also represented in the Met, has a nice canvas there, is like that. And so is Pollock, generally speaking, painting on unprimed canvases. But the other thing for Pollock is that usually when he was painting, he would simply put the canvas on the floor of his studio to get the drip effects, and it wouldn't be put on a stretcher until after he'd finished painting it, which is certainly unusual, or at least was in the time, in the creative process. As a result of this technique, though, when you go to his studio in Long Island, which I think you can make an appointment to see, which I've had a chance to see, you can actually see where various canvases were taped on the floor of his studio, and you can see the edges of great great paintings. You can see the edge of blue poles all around where the canvas was on the floor of his studio, and that's a really fascinating and wonderful experience.
Yeah, I would like to go. I've never been there.
So moving on from Pollock, we go to the greatest of the abstract expressionists, who's de Kooning. And he's also, incidentally, the one who is best represented in the collection of the Met, which is ironic because they have almost none of the paintings they've bought on display. Even when when the 20th century galleries were open to the public, not being redone as they are currently, they were displaying only 2 or 3 de Kooning canvases out of the many, many that they've bought. De Kooning had more great individual stages of art, more great styles than almost any other artist I can think of. You know what a Rothko looks like. Rothko had a Rothko style. There's a similar case with Pollock when he figured out his drip painting. See, there's pre-Pollock and there's the main Pollock thing. And it's similar with Van Gogh also. There are some artists, however, that had multiple distinct styles. And Picasso is certainly one of those artists. He made great paintings in his neoclassical style and in the rose and blue phases, and then he made some, not very many, great cubist paintings and so forth. But the painter who had the most different styles, completely different styles, is de Kooning. He probably had 5 or 6 completely distinct styles of painting. And the first great style was in the 1930s, where he was still painting figurative paintings that he really was beginning to go into an abstract direction. De Kooning has great drawing and great color. So he had the bifecta here. He didn't quite have the same great design sense that Gustav Klimt did, but having great color and great draftsmanship, he had great power at his disposal, and fortunately, he had a great deal of imagination, too.
Who do you think is the greater artist, de Kooning or Klimt?
That's a very difficult question. Ultimately, I would probably actually say de Kooning.
Yeah, so would I. I sort of thought you would say Klimt.
Well, I don't know exactly why. They're very, very top artists, and they're quite different. And Klimt had a great deal of creativity, a great deal of imagination. I think that ultimately de Kooning had perhaps even greater, I might say, artistic sincerity. There's something about his paintings that appeared just so essentially, like you were saying about Hemingway. You don't like Hemingway's later writing because it seems too self-conscious. Great art has to be non-self-conscious. It just has to be doing its own thing. And it's a problem that a lot of artists have in all genres, in all fields. Once they become popular, they try to reproduce what made them popular rather than continuing to do the art for its own sake approach. De Kooning never lost his art for his own sake. And in fact, rather like Fred Astaire not wanting to repeat a dance step that he'd done, which made it harder and harder for him to choreograph things, de Kooning never wanted to repeat himself in painting, and so was constantly inventing completely new ideas. And that relentless freshness, creative freshness, which lasted literally for his entire life until he died, is probably why de Kooning is the greater artist and one of the very greatest.
Yeah, I think he produced more great paintings than Klimt did.
That's possible.
He was more prolific, and I think he had a longer career. And
yes,
there's really even his very early and very late paintings, which look very different from his various great phases in the middle and are not as good, are still pretty great paintings in their own ways. And I think that's not necessarily true of Klimt's early stuff.
Well, let's go through quickly the stages for de Kooning. The beginning was in the 1940s, his Pink Angels phase. I think that painting is in the West Coast in Los Angeles, but there is a great painting from that era in the Met. It's just one that, again, is not on the wall. These are paintings that are recognizable as portraying human beings, but they're already rather distorted in form, and they use really bright, somewhat garish colors, but the colors really do work out. Very distinct nonetheless. Then de Kooning, during the late in the 1940s, moved into a black and white phase where he was simplifying things, also saving money. He moved to painting with house paints and enamels rather than oil paint, and he produced a fantastic and completely original series of his first completely abstract paintings, these black and white paintings. I think that was the first painting bought by a New York museum. One of the black and whites was bought by the Museum of Modern Art. One of these black and white paintings was also bought by the Met, and I've never, ever in my entire life seen it on the wall here, which is a tragedy. Then in the 50s, he moved to a third great style of painting, which is when he produced Attic, which is in the Met, and Excavation, which is in the Chicago Art Institute. And these paintings It was sort of like the move from black figure to red figure vases in Greek art.
Good analogy. Very good analogy.
He was going from primarily black with white lines to primarily white with black lines, and then began to introduce some color. And so this is the first of the great deconings that you're likely to actually encounter on the walls of the museum. Attic, it's a masterpiece. It's an epic painting, a large painting, and it's one that you could stand in front of for a very long time, absorbing the tremendous energy of this canvas. But then in the late 50s, he moved on to yet another style of painting where color really became dominant and the color areas became larger. The paint, which had been rather glossy with a lot of oil in it, became rather more matte. And this led to the Easter Monday type paintings. Easter Monday is a great canvas that the Met also owns, and they also often frequently display. Absolute masterpiece in a completely different style yet again. Then he moved on to, how many styles is that? We've got his pre-abstract, the early 40s paintings, then the black and white, then the attic and excavation style paintings, that's the third style, and then we get to Easter Monday, so that's 4 great styles. Then we get into the really expansive paintings like Door to the River and A Tree in Naples. Door to the River is in the Whitney in New York. A Tree in Naples is in the Museum of Modern Art. This is where the color takes over and the color shapes become everything. They become really large. He painted like this for a while. We're sort of in the 60s. He was very, very successful at this point. He built himself a studio out in Long Island, I think in the Hamptons, and moved into his 6th stage, which is the sort of soupy paintings, where again he introduces a lot of oil into the medium. A lot of women. He's painting very fluidly at this point, and so he reintroduces some figurative elements in his painting, which had not been in his paintings since the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, and I'm actually not crazy about the melty woman phase.
Nonetheless, they're also great paintings. I think they just take a different sort of appreciation. And so...
Yeah, well, I think the best thing to do would be to hang them upside down so you sort of don't recognize that they're figures and you look at them strictly as abstract works.
In any event, they are distinct in great phase. Then followed a phase of sort of bubbly color where he retained the somewhat wetter paint, the more oily paint, but went back into abstraction. And then we have paintings like The Screams of the Seagulls or something like that. We're getting into the 70s now. This is the 7th, by the way, his 7th completely distinct great phase of painting. And then finally, as he's moved to his new large studio, he also at this point has dementia, and his paintings begin to empty out. And we get his very spare final style of painting, where the painting is primarily white with a few colors, lines of color worked in. And for a long time, I didn't...
The toothpaste paintings.
Yeah, you might call them that. The texture does seem rather like it. For a long time, I didn't fully appreciate these paintings, I would say. And I thought they were none of his greatest. At this point, we're at his 8th distinct great style.
I find them depressing, but I find them depressing because I know that he's painting them with dementia.
I don't
actually. It makes
actually.
me sad for him.
I can now appreciate them just as great art. They had a show that included several of these canvases in Venice maybe 3 years ago, not at the Venice Biennale, but just at a gallery there. And it was actually a complete deconing show. So they had paintings from his whole life, but it was these very late 80s paintings that I ended up spending most of my time in. And they really took my breath away. I can't tell you how much more impressed I was than previously. I think that it was good to see several of these canvases together, which you really should have the opportunity of doing. And to me, he doesn't read as someone who's losing control of himself. It rather actually reminds me of late Beethoven, like the scherzo, the second to last scherzo that Beethoven wrote for Opus 109, where you can just sort of feel de Kooning floating away as the end of that piano sonata when Beethoven is floating away. It's the end of his life, and the music doesn't come to a jarring final halt. It just floats away like a balloon that someone has let go of. That's like late de Kooning. And so there you have...
See, a very melancholy, though trenchant analogy.
But there you have 8 completely distinct great styles of painting. What artist in all of history has reinvented himself so restlessly so many times? And that's why I think de Kooning is an even greater painter than Klimt.
Well, I think you were right when you said that the only painter who had as many comparable distinct phases was Picasso. And I think de Kooning is a far greater artist than
Yes,
Picasso.
because although Picasso had that restless desire to reinvent constantly, it was de Kooning who did so without a trace of self-consciousness. He simply wanted to make the greatest painting he was capable of making, the best painting he was capable of making at any given moment. That's what shines through and ultimately makes him really one of the greatest artists who ever lived. And so if you can...
So let me ask you this. I would say in the 19th and 20th centuries, the four greatest artists were de Kooning, Matisse, Klimt, and Van Gogh. How would you rank them?
Well, I don't think that's a complete compendium.
No, I'm just asking you to rank these four.
But among those, this is very difficult. The hardest for me actually is deciding who is greater between de Kooning and Matisse. I
would say that for me, the hardest choice would be who is greater, de Kooning or Van Gogh.
I can see that as well. I mean, Van Gogh is an incredibly great painter. I think that perhaps he didn't have... I mean, well, he really expressed himself as Van Gogh fully. It's just that, very bright light bulb that burned out quite quickly, like a flash bulb, the sort that photographers in the 30s used to use. One photograph and then it's done.
Another good analogy.
But Matisse, the greatest Matisses that you can see in America, and the greatest that I've ever seen, are in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I think, incidentally, that's a museum that stands up very well. In terms of the quality of its curatorship. They may not have as good a collection overall. They have a very great collection, but the curatorship there...
They have a Leonardo, which is something not many museums can say.
The way they display their art, especially in the Pay Gallery in the New Wing, is really excellent. And they have sort of a tower gallery for Matisse's gigantic cutouts.
Yes, it's one of the all-time great museum rooms.
It is one of the all-time great museum rooms. I hope they never change it because it's one of those things they're going to be itching to change sooner or later.
Right, but we'll do a National Gallery show at some point. Say just rank these four guys and then we'll move on.
I
follow your gut. Don't think about it too deeply.
All right, my gut says Matisse and then de Kooning, and then Klimt and Van Gogh.
Interesting. So I would disagree. I chose these four. We're talking about these four because they are essentially the four greatest painters of the last 200 years. They're all inconceivably great, but I think I would rank them Van Gogh, de Kooning, Klimt, Matisse. But I might put Matisse above Klimt depending on the day. But I think my favorite two are Van Gogh and then de Kooning.
Collectively, then, de Kooning gets the highest total points if you average out their scores from both of us. Which I think is fair. This is one of the things that I want to deal with, or to address, I should say, in our Museum of Everything. People think that museums should contain a single category of things, not realizing that what they think of as a single category isn't a single category at all. It's a clump of completely different things. What we think of as art when we discuss Matisse is completely different than what we think of as art when we're discussing Van Gogh. They were both painters, but the results are something completely different.
And you know what would look fantastic in the middle of a big room of Rothko's? Gordon Murray S1.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely
Gordon,
true.
if you're listening.
But art, just because it uses paint and goes on a canvas, doesn't mean that these things are remotely comparable. They're completely different. You might regard them as different arts. And
yes, that's why I mentioned the S1. These things are all beautiful and ought to be in the same place so you can look at them at the same time.
I just think that de Kooning and Matisse and Van Gogh and Klimt are incomparably great, but they each stimulate a slightly different part of your brain, and they reach a slightly different part of your emotional register as well. And so,
yeah, but you still need to be able to rank them.
Well, I do, and I think ultimately I put Matisse as the absolute top, and it's strange to me because I would not necessarily have said that Matisse is the greatest artist of the 20th century, but perhaps he was. Certainly, he's a legitimate candidate. I think
the greatest painter, not the greatest artist.
We should move through the rest of the 20th century galleries. And to remind you of de Kooning, what you'll actually see here, what you're likely to have a chance to see, is Attic, which is the great sort of 50s era de Kooning, and then late 50s, you can look at Easter Monday. These are both fantastic paintings. Beautiful, extraordinary. Again, completely different because they're different styles. The Met usually displays both of them. It's good that they have both of them. Beautiful and brilliant paintings. The other American painters you'll find in this area, Morris Louis, who I mentioned earlier, a color field painter. The greatest of the painters who is left in the collection is Franz Klee, who was an abstract expressionist who painted almost exclusively in white and black, or a very limited color palette. Occasionally he used some colors and really did extremely well. Franz Klee is a very great painter, not quite on the level of Rothko, Pollock, or de Kooning, but a great painter nonetheless. They have some excellent Franz Klee canvases here. They don't always display them in the best way. And then after that, there are a series of less important painters. They usually have something by Lee Krasner, who was Jackson Pollock's wife, and then a variety of increasingly unimportant painters and we get sort of into a pop art area with Andy Warhol and Klaus Oldenburg. Warhol is a painter who is, or an artist, I should say, generally speaking, tremendously overrated. He's interesting occasionally. The thing that I like about him are a series of silk screens where each one has a different color palette. Those can be interesting. They can occasionally border on fascinating. Are they beautiful? I don't really think so. Are they great art? I'm sure they're not. And
it seems like a joke that got carried too far.
Well, that's the thing with pop art. A lot of pop art and op art in general is that it was more or less supposed to be a joke. And you can get Klaus Oldenburg was at least an artist who knew it was a joke and didn't take himself too seriously.
Yeah, and Jasper Johns is genuinely great.
Jasper Johns is genuinely great, but he's an artist who you won't find very much of in these galleries either. There is one of his paintings there. Jasper Johns is an artist who's also much better represented at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Jasper Johns is of the post-abstract expressionist phase when we get into more pop art area. He was really still an abstract expressionist, but again, completely unique, as all great artists are. He invented his own style of painting, a couple of different phases. He rather humorously thought that since paintings were flat, you should only paint flat things. So he generally painted targets, maps, and flatware. And he also...
Flags.
And flags, yes. Famously, flags, numbers. He had his own sort of hash mark style, which was my favorite of the different styles. He was also a very distinguished colorist, but unfortunately you won't see him at the Met really well represented. At this point, you will have walked through, there's some Ellsworth Kelly here, of course, which is what you saw when you met Ellsworth Kelly. And
no, I only saw him in the Matisse Gallery.
Really? Because Ellsworth Kelly
in the Matisse show. It was a temporary show.
Ellsworth Kelly, I don't know if he really qualifies as a great painter. I don't wish to be unkind to his memory because he seems to have been a nice chap. I'll just say he wasn't on the level clearly of a Matisse or de Kooning and
in fact, I think his early drawings are better than the color field stuff that he's famous for.
Where he essentially had just very large, not maybe 3 colors in a painting sort of thing.
Yes, it's really not my favorite stuff, but he was a very nice guy, so we'll just leave it at that.
You can really see art dissolving at this point and into nothingness, not because art ran out of things to say, but because the artists that were being selected by collectors and gallerists were just the wrong ones, which I think encouraged art to go in an ever sillier direction. Which is never completely recovered
Richard
from.
Serra and Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons.
Yes, but again, these are more the province of the Museum of Modern Art. The next thing that will happen if you go down the steps at the far end, or at least as they used to have it in the Met, is there's an intermediate floor of contemporary art, which is so poorly selected that there's not really a single good painting to look at on that level. If you go downstairs further, you get to 20th century European and some 20th century American figurative art. And these are very, very great galleries indeed in terms of the quality of the pieces that are there. But this is another area where they were just not well displayed. And so I hope the Met can come up with something better in the new version. They have a little industrial design here, which is really interesting to see. It's curious, though, because given the scope of their collection, they've done much less well than, say, the Yale Art Galleries in New Haven have a really tremendous design section. You would say that maybe you should go to the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York to see design, because after all, it's a design museum. The Cooper Hewitt may be the single worst museum I've ever been. In New York at least. It's very near the bottom of the list, which is too bad because it's such a wonderful and interesting subject, and it could be the best museum if it tried, but it's not trying. However, there are some wonderful pieces of sort of the 20s and 30s industrial design era in the Met's collection, and this is where you would have found them. Walter Dorwin Teague's Bluebird radio, Donald Deskey's little cigarette boxes and some lamps, other radio designs. We actually have
some
talked
nice
about
coffee sets.
Yes, we've talked about industrial design on the channel a little bit, and they don't have many pieces on display, but the ones that they have are excellent. And so it's worth not just walking by if you see one of these cases. Stop to look at the objects, because they were the objects that were designed to make everyday life a little bit more attractive and really succeeded. Things like cocktail shakers, radios, and desk lamps that, for a time at least, allowed ordinary people to enjoy a more beautiful life. Also in this area, then, we're in 20th century European painting, which will go into 20th century American figurative painting. And the galleries bifurcate. And so you actually have to wander back on your tracks a little bit to see everything. But the first things that you'll run into are some very small paintings by Paul Klee, or Paul Klee. His name is spelled with two E's, but as I understand it, it would be pronounced Clay. So in any event, Paul Klee is...
Klee.
Yes, Klee. Paul Klee is an extremely interesting artist. And again, like great artists, is completely of himself, is unique, and came up with a style that is not like anything else. It is an extremely neurotic style of painting. And he generally did extremely small pieces, which I think is itself laudable. As art materials got relatively cheaper, through the 19th into the 20th century, artists relentlessly expanded the size of their canvases. Paul Klee fought against that in every conceivable way, and you could fit most of his drawings and paintings. Most of his drawings and paintings are considerably smaller than a modern TV set, are actually closer in size to a modern computer screen or a tablet even. They're really quite portable, and so if you were going to borrow a piece from the Met Museum, this would be a reasonable choice. They are...
You can borrow it under your jacket as you left.
Paul Klee had a unique style of drawing, a unique style of color, and there's something so skittish, I would say almost uncomfortable about these paintings. I think Paul Klee was a deeply uncomfortable man, deeply uncomfortable artist, but there's something that really connects to you because you can feel a sympathy with them. I almost want to take care of these paintings and find out what I can do to make them feel better. They require a certain amount of time to be spent standing in front of them, to connect with them, because they don't allow you in easily. They're somewhat prickly paintings, a little bit like a cactus or something. You have to stand in front of them for a bit, establish a rapport, and then once you have been admitted into dialogue with the paintings, you'll find them quite extraordinary and worth looking at. Because they don't take up very much space, the Met usually leaves a few of them on the wall, which is very good. And so if you have a chance to see Paul Klee here, you really should. Very good pieces. Now, if you look at the opposite wall, behind these Paul Klees, there's the Giacometti room, which is one of the biggest swings and misses of the entire Met, so another good chance for them to benefit by rearranging. The Met has a lot of great Giacomettis, and Giacometti is one of my favorite 20th century artists. And I mean, he's a painter too, so in fairness, I think he ranks at the very top also of the great 20th century artist list. And
Disagree.
Well, wrong. I mean, Giacometti was also relentlessly honest and truthful, as de Kooning was. And he was actually one of the first artists I really admired, along with Jasper Johns. And it had something to do, I think, also with the way the National Gallery in Washington has an excellent display of his sculpture. The Met has many wonderful pieces, but they don't display them in the concentrated force field of energy that they should. Giacometti sculptures should be grouped together as in a sculpture garden, so that the strength that emanates from them multiplies, and it's sort of like a nuclear reactor. The decay of these neutrons that are smashing into other atoms breaks them apart and creates more neutrons flying around, and that's how you get a nuclear chain reaction. That is what you need with Giacomettis. They need to stand close to each other so they can interact with each other and increase the radiation, as it were. The Met did the opposite of that and spaced them all out across the room, so you could never really see more than one of them at a time. And I don't know what blind fool of a curator came up with this idea, but it really is a disappointment. Nonetheless, they're still really great pieces to enjoy as are the paintings in this room. The room is further marred by...
I like Giacometti's paintings. I've never liked his sculptures. I know they're very popular. Everyone else seems to like them. I don't get it. They're interesting. I just don't find them beautiful.
Let me explain my view of Giacometti then. Giacometti was obsessed with the idea not of portraying realistically what a human looked like as a photograph would, that is, or as a completely like a cast of a human. If you used plaster of Paris and created a 3D model of a human, he wasn't interested in that type of portrayal. He wanted to create something that would give you the impression of standing in front of an actual human being. That is, that would have some human essence. And you could say that he didn't succeed in that. He said, this is an impossible task. And yet, I think he succeeds in part. When I'm standing in front of some of his sculptures, I do feel emanating humanity. And it's a very extraordinary feeling. Perhaps you've just been expecting the wrong thing from his sculptures. I find them really relentlessly fascinating and some of the greatest art ever, really. The Giacometti room is marred by the inclusion of some canvases by Balthus or Baltu, and he is one of the most disgusting painters in all of history. A genuine pedophile, and I don't know why.
Was he?
Yes, I mean he loved living with underage women, and he paints. You only need look at his paintings to see that they're filled almost entirely with adolescent and prepubescent girls.
I've never looked at any of this because I don't like Giacometti very much. I never go into this gallery, and I don't think I've ever seen Balthus' stuff.
All you have to do is take a look.
How is this not purged?
Yes, you'd think in the modern era of awareness of such things, he wouldn't be tolerated. He had pretensions of being an aristocrat, and so he laid claim to the title of the Count de Rolla, and he lived in a castle which he had his art dealer
James
buy him.
Lord mentioned this.
Yes, and living with an exceptionally much too young woman or series of much too young women, and painting even younger women. He's a really disgusting human being. He also was famous for having said that he had a greater need of a chateau than a French working man had of a loaf of bread. So he had delusions of grandeur. He was a pervert.
Piece of work.
And yes, a disgusting human being. And he was carried over the finish line into the museums by having a certain amount of artistic talent. He could draw. He had a decent, harmonious, although not distinguished or great color sense. But people seem to completely overlook the fact that he was painting young prepubescent girls who he wanted to sleep with, and that's really disgusting. And it's not like this is hidden. Look at the paintings. I mean, I assume you're looking at some of them now. Yeah, I'm not even going to put them on,
Yeah, no, I don't go into the Giacometti room. I've never looked at Balthus. I couldn't even have told you who he was if you asked me. I would have said he was a poet, like...
No, he's
what's that guy's name?
He's a really repulsive painter, and I am not in favor of the destruction of art, but I really don't consider his paintings to be art. I think
they're quite ugly.
They're quite ugly. More to the point, they are essentially. I don't want to say that they're child pornography.
I'm talking about the ones of, not the ones that you would ban strictly on content grounds, which some of these definitely qualify for that. But the ones that are of adults are also quite ugly.
Yes, I would just say
the landscapes are ugly. His color sense is terrible. Why do people like him?
Of all the artists in the Met Museum, he's the most repulsive, and he shouldn't really be there. He's a famous artist, a well-known artist, but he really shouldn't be. And I think that his presence reflects a lack of understanding and a lack of honesty in gallery curators. Anyway, let's move on from Giacometti. If you move through the rest of the galleries, as I said, there's sort of two parallel routes, and you have to go back and forth to make sure that you've covered both of them. But here are some of the artists who you will encounter. You'll encounter Modigliani, who is a genuinely great artist who died extremely young. He was most famous for his extremely plastic and engaging nudes, and the Met has one, which actually they haven't displayed in a long time.
Well, he's most famous really for the very elongated noses in the faces of his drawing. A very distinctive face style, which is why they can put a Modigliani in the James Bond movie Skyfall, and though I don't think they ever say it's Modigliani, everyone knows it's a fake Modigliani because he has such a distinctive style.
That's a good point. He had, well, again, like all great artists, a completely distinct style. He was a great draftsman, a great painter who came up with a unique style of painting. And even though he had this special, quite curvy and elongated style of drawing people's faces, all of his portraits are instantly recognizable. He was brilliant at capturing likenesses. He was incidentally a sculptor as well, and if you look at his sculptures, they have this similar Modigliani style about them. He was a friend of Brancusi, also a distinguished sculptor, much less great as an artist, and you'll see some of his sculptures there as well. The portrait of Jean Hébuterne, who was Modigliani's companion, and so Modigliani died extremely young of tuberculosis, and he was just in his 30s. The portrait of Jean Hébuterne, I think, is the best of his paintings that you're likely to actually encounter. She was so grief-stricken at his death that she committed suicide 2 days later, which is a very sad story. But he was madly in love with her, and she with him, it would seem. It's a very striking painting.
Which is nice for painters, because generally they seem to have had very turbulent personal lives.
Yes, but unfortunately, Modigliani...
I mean, it's not nice that she was so grief-stricken she killed herself, obviously. I mean, it's just nice that they were in love with each other.
Another artist in these galleries who died extremely young is Franz Marc. He was one of the, not exactly the Blue Rider groups, a Fauvi sort of German painter who liked paintings of animals, horses, and bulls. Another unique color palette that's very obviously Franz Marcian. Unfortunately, he was killed in the First World War when still an extremely young man, and so he didn't have a chance to develop into the artist he might have become. But of the German expressionists, he's one of my favorite, and a good deal easier to look at than a lot of the other German expressionists, some of whom you'll encounter here as well. Then there's Juan Gris, who is perhaps my favorite Cubist painter. Picasso invented the style of Cubist painting, and then it was carried forward by artists who had no talent like Braque and artists who had great talent like Gris. Cubism ultimately proved to be a dead end, but Gris's paintings are, again, a unique color sense.
Yeah, but it's not really a very good color sense. And I think probably the greatest failing of Cubism is that none of the great Cubists, quote unquote, had any color sense at all.
I disagree. I like Juan Gris very much. I think his paintings are quite beautiful.
I would certainly say he's my favorite of the Cubists, but also I don't really care for him.
I don't think that the Met has his most distinguished paintings, but they do have some that are worth looking at. And as you make this journey through 20th century art, he is a worthy stopping point. Then there are also the futurists like Umberto Boccioni. His statue of a walking man, which has sort of a flaming look to it. You'll recognize it because it's a very famous sculpture and probably the only famous futurist sculpture. The Met has one of these copies. Interestingly enough, Umberto Boccioni was actually a very distinguished draftsman. You might even say a great draftsman. And a self-portrait he painted is one of the greatest self-portraits in the entire museum. And I really mean in the entire museum. It is an absolute astonishing masterpiece. And guess what? The Met took it off the wall. So, however, if you look it up, Umberto Boccioni, generally speaking, not tremendously well known, but the Museum of Modern Art, incidentally, also has one of the bronzes of this futurist sculpture. So you'll probably recognize it when you see it. He was not perhaps great enough ultimately to produce very many pieces. A great artist in a very limited scope, you might say. And I think then we get on to the American artists who are covered down here. There are two who are especially worth discussing: Stuart Davis and Edward Hopper. Stuart Davis is, I want to say he's one of the candidates for greatest artist of the 20th century. Probably you won't admit that.
Not a question of admitting it. That's insane.
He is an extremely, extremely great artist. And I just bought his catalog raisonné because I was, many years ago, Yale came out with a catalog raisonné, which is a complete catalog of every work known to have been created by a particular artist. They did a very nice job. It was catastrophically expensive when it came out, but I managed to find a copy for cheap, and I'm absolutely delighted. Stuart Davis is kind of a jazz painter.
Jazz in the sense of Matisse's jazz?
No, Stuart Davis is a jazz painter in the sense
because his work does sort of resemble Matisse's jazz.
Yes,
stuff.
But I really mean it more as Stuart Davis is a jazz painter in the sense of jazz music. His painting is jazzy. It's vivacious. It is also very essentially American. And there's something about Stuart Davis that actually reminds me of Gershwin. People have called it a style of cubism, which it's not quite. It's also not quite abstract expressionism. It is really its own thing. There's no other artist who's quite like Stuart Davis with his unique combination of colors and shapes. He's also, again, very much himself. but really a tremendously great artist, and a couple of great paintings that you're likely to encounter in the Met, the report from Rockport, which is one of my favorite, and the Arboretum by Flashbulb, which is a really fascinating idea. His titles are great also. These paintings are vivacious and energizing. They're
The colors are wrong.
The colors are right. The colors are the most right thing about it. Well, the colors and the drawing. Stuart Davis is not like any other artist who ever existed.
These paintings just don't work. Not quite.
They may not work for you, but they are very great paintings indeed.
Well, I'm glad you like them.
They are some of his greatest paintings on the smaller scale. Later, he would move to a larger scale of paintings, which were perhaps even better. The Met, unfortunately, doesn't have any of those. The Met does have one of very large earlier canvases, which used to be in the instrument collection. That's not one of his best. But these smaller paintings, the Arboretum by Flashbulb and the Report from Rockport, are brilliant, wonderful paintings, American jazz. And I'd like to move on to Hopper and rest of American 20th century art, but because this episode is a little bit on the long side, I think we should probably cut it there and pick this up next time.
We'll pick it up with Hopper. That's a good place.
Yes, so we will start next time with one of my favorites of all American artists, Edward Hopper. Thanks for listening. I think we should again thank all of the people who are tuning in to listen to the podcast and who are watching our stuff on YouTube and Instagram. The support has been quite overwhelming and we are most appreciative. We hope that you will join us in our journey to actually build a real museum down here in South Florida, which is designed to genuinely be a museum of everything. That spans all genres and puts a huge number of interesting objects together in one place that would ordinarily never be allowed to be collected together.
Yeah, and I wanted to take a moment I sort of assumed the only people who are going to listen to us were in English-speaking countries, but we've got listeners, in addition to all the English-speaking countries, we've got a lot of listeners in the Netherlands and Germany, France, Sweden, South Africa, the Philippines.
We were
Iceland.
ranked 64 in Serbia, by the way.
Yeah, well, so I was going to come to that, but we're our highest ranking among all podcasts. Not in like a genre, but apparently among every podcast in the world, we're the 64th most popular podcast in Serbia. So we just want to say thank you, Serbia. We love you.
Absolutely. Please stay tuned.
I don't know who's listening to us in Serbia, but you're awesome. We were also ranked in Iceland, which is really nice. My new novel is about Iceland, so I've been reading a lot of Icelandic stuff, some of the Icelandic sagas from medieval Iceland lately. Also, did I mention the Philippines? Belgium. Shout out to the Belgians. We love you guys. I would say the most surprising places on the list, and there are a whole bunch more, but we have a number of listeners in Zambia, which I didn't think Spotify
But not
was,
Namibia?
No, I don't think we have anyone in Namibia, but I love Zambia, and I didn't check. I should have checked. Zambia borders the Victoria Falls, right? So I've always dreamed of seeing the Victoria Falls. So if someone in Zambia would like us to come and do like a live show there and look at the waterfalls,
the listens really do mean a lot, as do the interactions. So if you can let us know what you're interested in, we will cover those subjects. We'd love to hear from you. The final thing that I'll mention is that because you didn't know last time what I meant when I referred to Charvet, and again I'm wearing a Charvet tie. I think it's worth mentioning from a historical perspective because they are the most famous French silk maker, especially known for their neckties. And unfortunately, they were recently bought by a huge conglomerate, Louis Vuitton. So they're bound to, I'm worried at least, lose the essence of what made them so wonderful. I've enjoyed their neckties for many years, but what I would really have loved to have is a pair of their custom pajamas or a bathrobe. Well, here's the thing. The funny thing about Charvet is, so their store is just off the Place Vendôme in Paris. So you will know exactly where that is. And they have an upper level where they have all of these rolls of silk and all their different patterns and everything. And it's just kind of interesting to see essentially a warehouse in the middle of Paris full of all these different rolls of different silk patterns and bright colors.
I will say that though
you like colors. You like colors very much.
I've never had any interest particularly in clothing, but I do love colorful fabrics, and I do love going into a store with walls of colorful fabrics. I think it's a beautiful abstract impressionism. So maybe I'll check that out.
You should go to Charvet next time you're in Paris. We can only express the hope that they are not, in being subsumed by this huge conglomerate, robbed of their soul, though I fear very much that will become the case.
Just realizing that I don't think we have a single listener in France.
Well, perhaps this will change that.
Poland, Bulgaria, Morocco, Trinidad, and Tobago. Sorry, I was wrong. They're near the top of the list. That's why I missed them.
Splendid.
With the English-speaking countries. So yeah, we have a lot of listeners in France. So shout out to France. We love Paris. Dan loves Charvet. I love the rest of Paris. So
all right. Well, thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode, which we're going to pick up, resuming with the Met and beginning with Edward Hopper.
All right, great. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.